Welcome to Marginal Thoughts. Have you ever looked around the world, seen the news, or maybe even traveled a little, and just been struck by the incredible difference in how people live in different countries?
Yeah, absolutely.
You see places where things seem to work, where prosperity is pretty widespread,
Right.
and then others where life is just a constant struggle for so many people. It's like looking at two completely different worlds,
It really is.
sometimes just a short distance apart even. Why is that? Why are some countries wealthy and others, well, aren't?
That's a fundamental question, isn't it? One that's puzzled people for, gosh, centuries.
Mm-hmm.
We see this massive variation in, let's say, average well-being between nations.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference hasn't shrunk over time. If anything, it's kind of grown.
Right.
Understanding why. Well, it's complex, but it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty essential if we want to even begin thinking about how things might change.
And that's exactly what we're going to explore together today. So if you're just starting to, wrap your head around these big global ideas, or maybe you're just curious about the forces that shape economies,
Yeah.
you're in the right place. We're going to try and break down some of the key reasons behind this global wealth gap.
Okay, so first things first. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what we mean by rich and poor when we talk about countries.
Good brain.
We're not comparing like one person's salary to another's.
No.
We're talking about the overall economic output, the average well-being of basically everyone in that nation.
Right. It's about the average standard of living for the whole country.
Yeah.
And the usual way to measure this is something called GDP per capita.
Exactly. GDP per capita. Think of a country like a really, really big company,
Okay.
and it produces everything within its borders in a year. GDP, gross domestic product, that's the total value of all the final goods and services that the country produces. So GDP per capita. That's when you take that total value, right?
Yeah.
And you just divide it by the number of people in the country.
Okay.
It's a way of estimating the average income, or maybe the average production per person. Gives you a rough idea.
And the numbers here are just, well, they're staggering. You have some countries where the average per person production is like tens of thousands of dollars a year.
Yeah, huge numbers.
Yeah.
And then you have others where it's only maybe a few $100s. It's a vast range.
Wow.
And of course, within any country, there's variation.
Sure.
There are people doing better than average, people doing worse. Poverty exists everywhere, even in wealthy countries.
True.
But when we talk about a country escaping poverty, what we mean is increasing that average production per person significantly.
Okay.
It means experiencing sustained economic growth. That's the key.
Okay, so how does a country actually do that? How does it increase its average production per person? How does an economy grow and make its people, on average, more prosperous?
Well, fundamentally, it boils down to productivity.
Productivity.
Yeah. Workers in wealthier countries, they just tend to be much more productive. They can produce more value, more stuff, more services in the same amount of time compared to workers in poorer countries.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that productivity comes from what economists call the factors of production.
The building blocks of making things, is that it?
Precisely. Yeah, the building blocks. The first factor is physical capital.
Physical capital.
This is the tools, the machines, the infrastructure that people actually have access to.
Okay.
So imagine you're trying to farm a field with just your hands and maybe a stick
Right, hard work.
versus having a tractor, right? The tractor is physical capital. It lets you produce much, much more.
Okay.
This includes things like factory equipment, computers, roads, bridges, buildings, basically anything built that helps produce other things.
So more tools, better tools, that means more output. Seems pretty straightforward.
It is at that level. Then there's human capital.
Human capital.
Think of this as the tools, but like inside people's heads.
Ah,
Their skills, their knowledge, education, training, experience, all that stuff.
right.
A skilled engineer, for instance, can design a more efficient process than someone without that knowledge.
Sure.
A well-trained farmer understands irrigation, soil health, things like that much better. Investing in people's education and health.
Yeah.
That's how you build human capital.
So it's not just about having the right machines, but having people who know how to use them and maybe improve them, innovate.
Exactly. And that links to the third factor, technological knowledge.
Technological knowledge.
Yeah. This is the understanding of how to produce things. It's like the blueprints, the scientific discoveries, the process.
The recipes.
Yeah, the recipes. That's a good way to put it. The recipes that tell us how to combine those factors of production in better ways. It's the knowledge of, say, how to grow genetically modified crops or how to build a microchip.
Okay, so you need the tools, physical capital,
Yep.
the skilled people, human capital,
Right.
and the know-how, the recipes, technological knowledge. Is that everything?
Almost. There's one more crucial piece that kind of ties it all together. Organization.
Organization.
Yeah. You can have all the tools, skilled workers, and knowledge in the world.
Mhm.
But if they aren't organized effectively to produce things that people actually want and value,
Then it doesn't work.
right, you won't have a productive economy. This is where things like businesses, entrepreneurs come in. They take these factors, ideas, people, capital, and organize them to create goods and services.
Okay. So rich countries have more physical capital, more human capital, better technology, and they organize them well. But that still leaves the really big question, doesn't it?
Which is,
Why? Why do some countries manage to get more of these factors and organize them effectively, while others just don't?
now we're getting to the deeper reasons. It's not just having the factors of production. It's about why people and businesses are motivated to invest in them, build them up, use them efficiently.
Okay.
And that comes down to incentives. Yeah. People need good reasons, strong incentives, to work hard, to save money, to invest, to innovate, to start businesses.
Incentives. Can you maybe give an example? Like, what happens when those incentives are missing?
Sure. Think about a large country during a specific historical period, say mid-20th century. Yeah. There was a time when farmers were basically required to give nearly everything they produced to the state. They worked on collective farms.
Okay.
Now imagine you're one farmer out of, say, 100 working together. If you put in extra effort, work harder, grow one more basket of grain,
Yeah.
you'd only get to keep maybe 1/100th of that extra basket yourself.
Wow. So your personal effort didn't really translate into much personal reward at all?
Not really, not directly.
Yeah.
And when that link between your hard work and your own benefit is broken or severely weakened,
The motivation just disappears.
pretty much the incentive to work hard, to improve the land, maybe invest in a slightly better tool, it just evaporates. Why bother working those extra hours if someone else gets almost all the benefit?
Yeah.
And this lack of incentives, it dramatically reduced production. It contributed to, well, severe hardship in that case. The economy only really started picking up when policies changed, allowing farmers to benefit much more directly from what they produced.
Right.
As people said back then, it's different when you're working for yourself and your family.
That makes total sense. If I can see a clear benefit coming back to me from my effort, I'm much more likely to actually make that effort. So good incentives are fundamental. Okay. But what determines if a country has good incentives or bad ones?
This is where we get to maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. Institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah.
Like banks and governments?
Well, yes, those are types of organizations, but in economics, institutions mean something broader. Think of them as the rules of the game in a society.
The rules of the game. Okay.
Yeah. They're the formal rules, like laws and regulations, but also the informal rules, like social norms and conventions. They shape how people interact, and crucially, they shape the incentives we just talked about. And there's a wide consensus among economists that strong growth-promoting institutions are really key to prosperity.
So what kind of rules are we talking about? What makes for good institutions?
Okay, a really foundational one is secure property rights.
Property rights.
This means you have the right to own things, land, a business, the money you earn, maybe invention you create, and not just own it, but use it and benefit from it.
Right.
If you build a factory or you plant a crop, you need to be pretty confident that someone, whether it's another person or even the government, won't just come along and take it from you without fair compensation.
Okay.
Without that security, people are just hesitant to invest or save or start businesses. The risk is just too high.
So knowing what's yours is protected. That's crucial.
Absolutely. Another key institution is having relatively free and open markets.
It's free markets.
Yeah. This means people and businesses can generally buy and sell goods and services without excessive government restrictions or interference. Markets are pretty good at signaling what people want and encouraging innovation to meet those needs.
But you need some rules, right? For safety or fairness.
Oh, definitely.
Uh-huh.
Of course. Some regulation is necessary.
Yeah.
But when government control becomes too heavy-handed, it can really stifle economic activity. Finding that balance is important.
Okay, a balance. Got it.
Then there's the rule of law. This is a big one.
Rule of law.
It's the principle that everyone, and that includes people in government, is subject to and accountable under clearly defined laws, not arbitrary decisions.
Okay.
It provides predictability. Stability. If you're signing a contract or making a long-term investment, you need to trust that the legal rules won't suddenly change on a whim.
That stability for planning ahead. Yeah, that seems vital.
It truly is. And tied very closely to that is having an honest and accountable government.
Honest government, less corruption.
Exactly. High levels of corruption.
Hmm.
It basically acts like a massive, unpredictable tax on everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to pay bribes just to start a business or get permits or win contracts, it discourages legitimate activity. People just won't bother, or they'll operate informally.
Yeah.
And corruption also diverts resources. Money that could be used for essential public services, schools, hospitals, roads gets siphoned off. And those services are necessary for development.
So corruption doesn't just hurt individuals, it really undermines the whole country's potential for growth.
It really does. And finally, political stability is important.
Stability makes sense.
Countries that experience frequent conflict, coups, major unrest, they're just risky places to invest for the long term. And you need a dependable legal system, too, one that can enforce contracts and resolve business disputes fairly and, reasonably efficiently.
Wow. Okay, when you lay it all out like that,
Huh.
property rights, free markets, rule of law, honest government, stability. It makes a lot of sense. These things create an environment where people feel secure enough to take risks, invest, work hard,
Yeah.
and trust that they'll actually benefit from their efforts in the long run.
Exactly. They create the right incentives over the long term. A powerful real-world example people often point to is the Korean Peninsula.
North and South Korea?
Right. Same history, same culture, same ethnicity, essentially. But after they were divided, they adopted vastly different institutions.
Very different.
One, the South,
Hmm.
eventually moved towards institutions emphasizing private property markets, rule of law, more or less. The other, the North, became a centrally controlled state, lacking those features.
And the outcomes?
Dramatically different. Over decades, South Korea experienced incredibly rapid economic growth, became a prosperous, technologically advanced nation. North Korea remained extremely poor, despite starting from a very similar place historically.
That's a really stark illustration. Same people, same geography mostly, but very different outcomes based on the rules of the game.
It really highlights the power of institutions.
Eh.
Now, it's worth noting the path isn't always simple or linear.
How so?
Well, some countries that grew very fast, like South Korea initially, or more recently China, did so under governments that played a very active, sometimes authoritarian role in directing the economy, especially in the early stages.
Ah,
Sometimes before fully democratic institutions were in place. And reforming institutions is incredibly hard. It often faces huge resistance from groups who benefit from the way things currently are.
so institutions are like the bedrock, creating the right incentives. But it sounds like maybe it's not the only thing going on.
No, you're absolutely right. It's definitely a multi-layered puzzle. Institutions are hugely important, maybe the most important single-factor group, but other things play a role too. Geography, for instance.
Geography, like mountains and rivers.
Yeah, but we need to be careful how we think about this. There were some older, really flawed theories that tried to link climate directly to, inherent human capabilities or laziness.
Oh, right. Those sound problematic.
They are. They're completely wrong, and were often used to justify really harmful things like colonialism. The real geographical challenges are different.
Okay, so what kind of real challenges?
Well, think about natural resources. Having valuable resources like oil or minerals, it could be a source of wealth.
Sure, like Saudi Arabia or Norway.
Right. But it's absolutely not a guarantee. Some countries with immense resource wealth are still very poor. Think of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, or Venezuela's struggles despite vast oil reserves.
Yeah.
It's often called the resource curse. Sometimes having that wealth can actually undermine development, especially if the institutions are weak.
How?
It can lead to corruption, fighting over who controls the resources, neglect of other parts of the economy. It can distort things.
So having resources isn't enough. How you manage them matters, which ties back to institutions again.
Exactly. It loops back.
Yeah.
Climate itself can also present real challenges separate from those old bad theories.
Like,
Well, tropical regions, for example, often face tougher hurdles for large-scale agriculture compared to temperate zones. Things like less predictable weather patterns, faster soil depletion in some areas,
okay.
and also a higher burden of certain debilitating diseases like malaria, which can significantly impact human health and productivity. Even just extreme heat can lower productivity for physical labor.
So climate can create real obstacles, but it doesn't, determine a country's destiny.
Precisely. It's a challenge to be overcome, not a fixed fate. Location also matters.
How so?
Countries that are landlocked, meaning they don't have direct access to the sea, often face higher costs for trade.
Ah, getting goods in and out is harder.
Much harder and more expensive than for countries with good ports or access to major navigable rivers. Think about many nations in the middle of Africa, for example, compared to coastal hubs. It makes participating in the global economy more difficult.
And trade itself is another big factor, right? Being part of the global economy.
It is, yes. Access to international markets lets countries specialize in producing things they're relatively good at, export them, and earn income.
And import things they need.
Exactly. Import capital, technology, goods they can't produce efficiently themselves. Countries that are isolated, either geographically or through high trade barriers they put up themselves, tend to face disadvantages in growth.
What about the past? Does, history play a part in this?
Oh, absolutely. The historical path a country has taken matters a great deal. For many, many countries, the legacy of colonialism is significant.
How does that affect things today?
Well, colonial systems were often designed primarily for resource extraction, not for the benefit of the local population or for building strong, independent local institutions.
Right.
The borders drawn, the types of governance structures put in place, these often created long-lasting challenges that many countries are still grappling with today.
So it's like some countries got a head start while others started way behind.
In a way, yes. It contrasts with countries that began industrializing earlier and developing modern economic and political structures over a longer period. History casts a long shadow.
We mentioned human capital earlier. With education, does that stand alone as a factor too?
Definitely. While we talked about it as a factor of production, the level of investment in widespread education and health is also seen as a distinct driver of growth in its own right.
So just generally having healthier, better educated people.
Yes. A healthier workforce is simply more productive. A better educated workforce is more innovative, better able to adopt and adapt new technologies, more flexible. Countries that fail to invest adequately in their people really struggle to develop complex modern economies. You also sometimes see the brain drain issue.
Where skilled people leave.
Exactly. Educated people leave for better opportunities elsewhere, which further hampers the home country's development.
And what about population? Does the number of people or how fast the population grows matter?
It can, yes. The rate of population growth matters. Very rapid population growth, especially in countries that already have limited resources and weak economies.
It puts a strain on everything.
It really can. Strain on food supplies, housing, the job market, infrastructure like schools and hospitals. It can make it much harder for that average income, the GDP per capita, to actually rise, even if the total economy is growing a bit.
Okay. And sometimes people bring up things like culture or social factors. Is that part of the picture?
It is, although it's often a sensitive and difficult area to discuss precisely.
Yeah.
Some researchers look at cultural attitudes towards things like work, saving, innovation, risk-taking, trust, how these might influence economic behavior. Also, social factors like inclusion are really important. Societies that exclude large parts of their population based on gender, ethnicity, religion, whatever, they're essentially not using their full potential workforce or talent pool.
Right, leaving talent on the sidelines.
Exactly. So things like gender equality, minority rights, these aren't just social justice issues. They arguably have real economic implications, too. While it's hard to measure the exact impact, these underlying social dynamics can definitely play a role.
Wow. Okay, it really is a lot of interconnected pieces, isn't it? Institutions, geography, resources, climate, history, trade, education, population, culture.
It is. There's no single, simple answer to why some countries are rich and others are poor. Anyone who tells you there is, well, they're probably oversimplifying. It's a complex interaction of all these things. Historical forces, geographical realities, economic policies, social factors, and, yes, crucially, the quality of a nation's institutions, those rules that shape the incentives.
So if you had to sort of weigh them.
It's tough, and economists debate the exact weighting. But the general consensus is that while geography, trade, history, and other factors are absolutely important and can present real significant challenges, it's the strong institutions that provide the essential framework, the foundation that allows a country to build capital, attract investment, foster innovation, manage its resources effectively, educate its people, basically create the conditions for long-term sustainable prosperity.
So institutions enable countries to deal with the other challenges.
That's a good way to think about it. Some studies have tried to quantify this, suggesting institutions might explain a very large portion, maybe half, maybe even more, of the huge differences we see in national wealth across the world.
That really puts the importance of those rules, those frameworks, into perspective.
It does. They aren't the only thing that matters,
No.
not by a long shot. But they seem to be the bedrock upon which lasting growth is built.
This has been incredibly insightful, really, just exploring this massive global puzzle and thinking about how much a country's prosperity seems to be shaped by these huge, complex factors, institutions, history, geography, things largely outside any single person's control.
Hmm.
What does this tell us, maybe, about our own lives or how we view others around the world who are facing very different circumstances?
That's a great question to reflect on, I
Yeah.
think. Well, it should probably give us all a sense of perspective, maybe some humility.
How so?
Much of the opportunity we might have, or the stability and prosperity we might experience.
Mm.
It isn't solely down to our individual choices
Mm.
or our own hard work as much as we like to think it is.
Right?
It's deeply, deeply influenced by the society we happen to live in, the strength of its institutions, its history, its geography,
Mm.
the context into which we were born. And recognizing this complex web, maybe it can foster a greater understanding, maybe more empathy for people in countries facing these immense systemic challenges. Challenges that are largely beyond any one individual's control.
Yeah.
It helps us see that poverty, especially national poverty, isn't simply a lack of effort or talent. It's often the outcome of really difficult historical paths, challenging environments, and crucially, the absence of those foundational rules needed for prosperity to take root and grow.
Yeah. That's definitely a lot to think about. Thank you so much for guiding us through all of this complex territory.
It was my pleasure. It's a fascinating and hugely important topic.
It really is. And thank you out there for joining us for this exploration on marginal thoughts. We genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this. What factors do you think are most important in explaining the wealth gap? Let us know in the comments below.
Yeah, please do.
And if you found this conversation helpful, maybe helped you understand the world just a little bit better, be sure to subscribe to Marginal Thoughts for more explorations of big ideas.